unless and until we fix the damage of Brexit, the growth mission is going to be muted. The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And there's still time to win one of our merch bundles signed by Alastair and me if you switch energy suppliers to Fuse by the end of January.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics to sign up. And merch on no merch, it is worth considering switching to Fuse. They're a green electricity supplier generating power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables.
Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money, even though the price cap has gone up. And their customer service is excellent. Fuse offer 24/7 support and promise they'll answer any query within a minute on the Fuse app.
So download it now, use the referral code politics after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for terms and conditions and to learn all you need to know.
Welcome to the Rest is Politics question time with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. And now, Rory, let's get on to one of my favourite subjects.
Okay, good. Yes.
Guess what it is?
Could it be Brexit by any chance?
Well, fun enough, somebody called Graham Merck, he starts his question with the word perseverance, which probably means he's asked it 20 times before. Why won't Labour face up to the fact that Brexit is a disaster and that addressing it would provide the instant growth they're looking for? Are they scared of Farage and the mob? Mo, why is Labour so afraid to talk about Brexit? Despite the reach out from the EU, Labour only seem to want security cooperation. Then goes on to add, should Canada join the European Union, which is quite an interesting thought. But I don't know if you saw, Roy, over the weekend, there was a poll, YouGov poll, done for Best of Britain, 15,000 people, one of these MRP polls. And it said that almost half, 46%, say the European Union should be the government's top priority on trade, 22% the US, 4% China, 6% another country. And in every single constituency, including Clacton, including Boston and Skegness, the places where reform are top, there is overwhelming support for Britain prioritising trade relationship with the EU over the US.
And I think actually Trump's election is going to change things a lot, because when people were voting in Brexit, they were voting in an environment in which the relationship with the US was very stable. It seemed as though Britain had this special relationship. And actually the world was pretty stable. People were less worried about China. And therefore, for the Brexiteers who were saying, you know, we can leave the European Union, look, there are these, and Europe's not growing very fast, its economy's not very strong, so let's hitch ourselves to these big growing economies in China and the US. It almost seemed plausible. And two things happened. The first thing, of course, is that relationships with China collapsed. And so suddenly it seems very dangerous to tie your economy too closely to China, and China's not growing very fast at the moment. But now Trump's election, I think, whatever people feel, you know, day to day, they must in their back of the mind be beginning to pick up on the fact that this guy is not to be counted on, that in the end, Britain is not going to be able to rely in the way that it has for 70 or 80 years on a stable, pretty predictable United States that's going to have its back. And when that happens, if the world's beginning to splinter into an American bloc, a Asian bloc, a European bloc, well, strategically, I mean, not just economic, but strategically, where should the UK be? And I would argue with Europe.
I'm going to give my friend Neil Kinnock another name check, because we talked about him last week in relation to populism. He had an interview in the iPaper this week, and I know Neil very, very well. And I can read the words, and the headline was something like, you know, Kinnock calls for Labour reset to start meaning something. That was the sort of theme of it. But I think beneath it, I could sense a real feeling that we're in danger of giving up a huge opportunity. Because you and I heard in Davos from the Europeans, they still have a kind of lingering respect for the UK. They want the UK deeply involved, particularly on defence. But I remember I was talking to one European, not a leader, but a minister, who said that, you know, we're sort of sitting there thinking, well, we keep hearing about reset. What is it? When is it coming? What is this going to mean? And I think, to go back to the questions on this, I think there is a sense of where they're still trapped in a debate that was a few years behind us. Farage has kind of he's moved on to other things now. So I think we are missing a trick. And I think in relation to growth, unless and until we fix the damage of Brexit, the growth mission is going to be muted. Gemma Brooks, Rory, wants to know what we think about Lukashenko winning a 7th term in Belarus, when the EU and the UK both say it cannot have been free or fair.
Quick reminder just on Belarus, and then tell us about the election. But so Belarus, people not completely concentrating, it's a big chunk of territory just north of Ukraine, just west of Russia, and just east of Poland. So it's like the yellow bit of a fried egg, and the white around it would be Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Russia, and Ukraine. And it's a bit of, I think I've said before in a podcast, I was angling to be the ambassador to Belarus in 2006. And in those glory days, I was being encouraged to do it on the grounds that this was going to be the last autocracy in Europe that was going to become a democracy. And I'd be there, at the moment of the transition when Belarus came into the European Union, this kind of stuff. Anyway, over to you on what's happened since.
Well, let's just congratulate Lukashenko. He won 87.6% of the vote. I mean, this is a compelling win, 7 in a row, but it's remarkable. I think it was Condi Rice who said that Lukashenko was the last European dictator. So he's been there now for 30 years. It is literally a sham election in that the 4 other candidates spend most of their time saying how well Lukashenko does. There was one bit during the campaign when he was asked about how the election was going, and Lukashenko said, "Oh, I'm not really following it very much." But then, of course, I don't know if you saw, I sent you the video of the kind of celebrations this morning of this sort of, it was an amazingly well produced thing. And there is a question: why do these dictatorships bother having these sham elections? And the fact is that because they do get written up around the world as, Lukashenko wins 7th term. And we all know, but a lot of people don't necessarily know that the sort of deeper background of what's going on. And of course, the reason he matters more than just being the leader of this very dictatorial, authoritarian leader of, as you say, quite a sizable country, is because he is very, very close. Well, I mean, the Belarus opposition call him Putin's puppet. He is Putin's puppet. He does what Putin tells him. It's partly the Ukraine assault was launched with Belarusian help. So, but it's a pretty depressing state of affairs.
It's interesting also because a reminder of people of that age. So I guess he's 70.
Yeah.
And Donald Trump, I guess, is in his mid-70s now.
78.
78, right. So how these people, their careers, of course, stretch back into what feels like a very different world. Lukashenko was very much part of the old Soviet Union, served in, I think, the border troops in the late 1970s, and then ran a proper collective communist state farm through the 1980s for Belarus, and then joined the Supreme Soviet of Belarus as a member of parliament, established his reputation weirdly as an anti-corruption campaigner. So there was a brief moment in kind of early 90s where people thought, or some people might have thought, there was a bit of a glimpse of some other possibility with this guy, which was just enough in that moment in the early 90s when obviously the Soviet Union was collapsing to leverage himself into position as the president. And then as you say, since then, this autocracy. It's a country, population just under 10 million people. So comparable, I suppose, to the population maybe of Israel, about that population. It's got a GDP per capita, though, very, very low. I mean, so, about in real terms, maybe $6,000 a head a year. Places like Lithuania now would be 2 or 3 times wealthier per capita in nominal terms, having started at the same level. So what's really happened is it's a story of the way that I think Belarus wasn't a long way off places like Romania and Lithuania in the early 90s, and the difference that's been made for those countries that joined the European Union, joined the West in their development, and Lukashenko sticking Belarus where it is.
There's a parallel with Trump and what's happened with Trump's second term. Okay, we're talking here about 7th successive term. But we talked when we did the live with Scaramucci recently about how strangely, not silent, but how strangely muted the feeling of resistance to Trump was compared to the first term. This time in Belarus, it feels strangely muted, other than there are protests worldwide. There have been protests going on in different parts of the world because, of course, most of his real opponents are either in prison or they're in exile. But this is because the last time, when he definitely lost the election, but claimed, I think he got 82% in the claim last time, but they ended up arresting 65,000 people. Thousands were sort of beaten up in jail. And so this time it feels that the opposition is abroad rather than there. We've got to give a shout out, by the way, to old Steve Rosenberg for the BBC. I watched parts of the press conference that Lukashenko did to celebrate this historic win. And Steve Rosenberg, gave him some pretty direct questions about, this. Can you really say this is an election when most of your opponents are in prison or exiled? And there's been no campaign as such at all. And Lukashenko clearly knew who Steve Rosenberg was and said, well, you have prisons in Britain. You put people in prison. And Steve Rosenberg's made me, yeah, but not just for sort of opening their mouths. And Lukashenko said, well, prison is a place for people who open their mouths too wide. The other thing that he did was Steve Rosenberg asked him a question. No, just made an observation. It's a very strange election. Very strange kind of election. And Lukashenko says, well, that's a nice new experience for you, Steve. And lots of the Belarusian journalists and people then sort of laughing and applauding this great wit. So it's bloody depressing. But of course, Putin will be happy with that one, just as he's been happy with other elections that have happened recently.
Brits may also, finally, just before we leave Belarus, remember it a little bit, because in 2021, there was quite a famous case where people on a Ryanair flight from Athens to Lithuania were cheerfully on their way back home when suddenly the plane was diverted in Belarusian airspace and forced to do an emergency landing in the capital city of Belarus. And they did it because, very unfortunately, the Belarusian dissident journalist, I think called Protasiewicz, was on the plane just trying to fly from Athens to Lithuania and found himself, of course, abducted off the plane and has now been chucked in prison. But terrifying, these planes. It's a trick of autocratic regimes which comes up occasionally, which is that people think they're safely flying not to that country and then suddenly find, in this case, a Ryanair plane forcibly diverted and they get abducted. Yeah.
Peter Judge, distribution of wealth. Do you agree that the current distribution of power, wealth and resources is gross, unjustifiable and unimaginably damaging? If not, what adjectives would you use to describe the current distribution of power, wealth, and resource?
Quick start on that. So the three wealthiest people in the United States, who are Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and Jeff Bezos, I think, their wealth is now the same as the entire bottom 50% of the United States. And their wealth is also an astonishing amount of the entire global population. I mean, because they are in the many, many hundreds of billions of dollars. But there's also, there's so many ways of looking at this. There's the work that was done on equality. It's our friend the Mooch who points out that when Mitt Romney's dad was the head of General Motors as chief executive of this big company, he lived in a relatively modest home in Detroit. He drove a pretty ordinary car, whereas by the time you get to his son, Mitt Romney, you're in a completely different universe where Mitt Romney has multiple houses, private jets, and the multiple between a CEO and a worker, which was, in Britain and the United States at sort of 30-fold, is now well up above 200, 300-fold in many cases.
I don't know what adjective you would use, but it's appalling, it's horrific, it's getting worse. And I mentioned to you the other day that I'd been rereading, to use that great Tory phrase, I'd been rereading The Gospel of Wealth by Carnegie. And of course, Carnegie was one of the richest people in the world at the time that he was alive, I think he wrote The Gospel of Wealth in the late 1880s. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes from it. The problem of our age is the proper administration of wealth, so that the ties of brotherhood may still bind together the rich and poor in harmonious relationship. Well, I've never seen that on Elon Musk's Twitter feed, that thought. And he then goes to say, there are but three modes in which surplus wealth can be disposed of. It can be left to the families of the deceased, it can be bequeathed for public purposes, or finally, it can be administered during their lives by its possessors. And he goes on to explain why, in his view, the third is the best. And he basically comes out for massive inheritance tax for those who don't use their wealth judiciously during the time that they're alive. And I just think we are now looking at people, as I keep banging on about the book, The Sovereign Individual, I think that is what we have now, people who feel they're above the law, above democracy, above politics, but also above really having to do things for their fellow man and woman. And I do think this is the single biggest political issue. And it is a big driver, I think, of this far-right stuff, because the sovereign individuals somehow are persuaded the common man that it's almost, with the exception of Maloney, it's almost always a that he's on their side. But what's going to happen, we're seeing it already with Trump in power, they are going to get wealthier and more powerful and care less, it seems to me, about the people they claim to be for.
It's astonishing. I'm looking a little bit at this because I was in the Channel Islands and I was talking to somebody who manages money for big Middle Eastern families in the Channel Islands. And I was trying to say, what do they do with this money? What's the point of being worth 100 million, 200 million, 300 million? I mean, you can't really spend it, can you? And they said what they're doing now is they're setting up trusts to try to make sure, if you're in the many billions, that you can provide for the seventh generation. Yeah. So it's you're not just thinking about your grandchildren, you're trying to sort of create this insane structures. The other thing, I've often thought about this, that we've got this very odd thing that everybody in Parliament says they believe in equality. Tories maybe talk about equality of opportunity, others might be brave enough to talk about equality of outcome, but in fact, before we even begin talking about equality, we are a million miles away from anything touching equality in any of the programs of any of these parties. The Labour Party is not going to get us anywhere close to equality, but we could be at least aiming to reduce inequality.
Yeah.
Right. We could be aiming to look more like Sweden, these Scandinavian countries where, again, this stuff from Piketty is very convincing that you have better mental health outcomes, you have better health outcomes, you have better education outcomes, that having a society with less extreme inequality is good. But I don't know how you get that you can have that conversation maybe in Europe. You can look at Scandinavia and talk about that.
But even there, Rory, you're finding a bit of a backlash to it. And I think the peculiar British problem is this belief that we are entitled to low taxation and exceptional public services. The Scandinavians and the French actually kind of accept that if you want exceptional public services, you're going to have to pay for them, and the best form of payment is through the taxation system. We don't necessarily, at a deep level, have that. And let me just to show you though how far these are the people, the Carnegies of this world, who were called the robber barons. They had as bad a reputation in some ways as, in fact, probably a worse reputation in many ways than the current tech robber barons. But just, he says this, he's talking about inheritance tax. Men who continue hoarding great sums all their lives, the proper use of which for public ends would work good to the community, should be made to feel that the community, in the form of the state, cannot be deprived of its proper share. By taxing estates heavily at death, the state marks its condemnation of the selfish millionaire's unworthy life.
Very good. Very good.
Brilliant.
And really, really interesting. So I was talking to some very wealthy people on the West Coast and trying to understand why they don't give away more money when they're alive. Because many of them have signed up to this giving pledge, which Bill Gates and Warren Buffett did.
Yeah.
And the weirdness is they've all signed up to it, but they're just not handing over the money. And initially they say to you, well, it's just that we can't find projects good enough to absorb our money. So we're just thinking more. They can be thinking for 10, 12 years, trying to find the right kind of project to give their money to, right? So then you come with real evidence. So, obviously we've talked in the past about that's very good evidence that direct cash transfer makes difference to very poor people in, sub-Saharan Africa. And then they say, oh, well, we're just waiting just in case there's a new tech innovation or AI innovation. One of them, though, finally over a drink said to me, what you don't understand is that the amount of money you're worth has an incredible impact on your influence at the very top level of American society. And if you give your money
away... But that's part of inequality. If you measure status by wealth, that is part of inequality.
Exactly. So he was explaining that, let's say you're worth 4 billion, right? 4,000 million. And some of these people, some of them live relatively modestly, right? They're only spending a tiny fraction of that. But if they were to suddenly give away 3.9 billion, their fear is that suddenly nobody wants to talk to them. The White House wouldn't invite them to stuff. Their friends wouldn't care about them. They wouldn't appear in the right lists. They wouldn't be getting their honorary degrees. They wouldn't be able to influence stuff. And of course, a lot of this is competition between them. I mean, it's obviously this is going to upset listeners. Getting into the mindset of these people is pretty unpleasant. But there's a very, very strong sense that they're all measuring. And of course, Musk is part of a movement that believes the richer you are, it proves how clever you are, and that people who aren't wealthy aren't clever.
I was talking to somebody who knows all of these people and who has worked with all of these people as well, and had listened to our podcast, was it last week or 2 weeks ago, and said I was 100% right, that Zuckerberg was entirely driven by getting as far up Trump's backside as Musk had already got, Musk having already penetrated deep, deep, deep into the backside. Which is right, by the way. Susie Wiles has said no office for Musk in the West Wing.
It's got to move across the executive office, which is across the street.
Yeah.
Did your friend confirm what I'd heard, that Zuckerberg is genuinely worried that he might be put in prison?
No,
he didn't feel that?
Asked about that and felt no, probably not, but is genuinely scared. Not necessarily going to jail, but I think more the commercial business stuff, that if he doesn't get in with the program, then there is an awful lot the government do to damage him. But, Trump, as you know, is on record as saying he would have gone to jail. So it's, you can't not have that hovering in the back of your mind.
Okay, let's take a quick break, Alastair. Come back for more questions. Support for this episode comes from Channel 4 and their new two-part drama, Brian and Maggie, about the infamous grilling of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher by Brian Walden. Now, Alastair, since it's question time, what, in your opinion, are some of the most disastrous moments in political TV history, and what happens behind the scenes?
I'm trying to think of Brian Walden interviews. I mean, younger listeners may not remember. Brian Walden was a terrific interviewer, and he was really serious, really did his research. He was a former MP, a Labour MP, but he was a Labour MP that Tories didn't mind being interviewed by, because I think they felt he was fair. And Margaret Thatcher, what this programme, this two-part drama, Brian and Maggie, is about, isn't just about the interviews and where they go. It's also about this sort of curious relationship that developed around it. And I'll be absolutely frank, Rory, I think the podcast is maybe filling a little bit of that space, but I wish we had more Brian Waldens around. I wish we had more viewers who would actually want to watch very long, very detailed TV interviews.
And were there any interviews that really did bring down people? I mean, I suppose it was Frost Nixon. I mean, were you sometimes terrified with big interviews with Tony Blair that this could be the end of everything?
Not the end of everything, but I think that there were definitely interviews where you came out and thought, oh God, that didn't go so well. But no, nothing that was absolutely destructive. I think I've told you before about the time when Ron Davis famously resigned after a moment of madness on Clapham Common. And I'd lined up for John Sargent to come and do this pooled interview. So John Sargent, chief political correspondent then at the BBC, and he sat down and I said, Ron, you've got to be apologetic. You've got to apologise for this because otherwise people won't understand and da-da-da. Anyway, and so he did. He duly apologised, but it was kind of undermined by the fact that written across his hand was the word sorry. as a reminder that he should say sorry. So that didn't go down terribly well. There was the famous interview. I'm going to be at, on the day this comes out, actually, I'll be playing the bagpipes at John Prescott's funeral. And there was the famous time when John Prescott was doing an interview and said, he gave his answer and they said, oh, sorry, that was absolutely shit. Can we do it again? And the interviewer said, this is live, Mr. Prescott. So there was all sorts of things. But I think, do you know what I think about the way interviews have developed is that because we're into the sort of gotcha style journalism a lot of the time, the politicians have just got very, very good, the best ones, at working out where the balls are coming from, how to play them. And they've become a bit sterile because I think that, and I do think that what Brian Walden did, he made the encounters interesting. Funny enough, his voice and because he had a Midlands accent, wasn't a sort of classic broadcast. And he was very, very thorough and very, very serious, respectful, but really, really steely.
Lovely. Well, there we are. So we hope that's answered the question. And you can stream both episodes of Brian and Maggie now on Channel 4.
Welcome back to the Rest is Politics Question Time with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
Now, Amy Taylor, Rory, wants to know, if I leave X, which a lot of people are doing, is there another way to submit questions?
Well, the answer is there are many ways to ask questions. So we can get questions by emailing us, get questions on Instagram. You can also become a subscriber, which has a huge number of benefits. And one of them allows you to engage on our Discord platform and ask questions there, as well as getting ad-free listening. Ian Barnard, why is Canada important? Rory recently mentioned that Canada is important. Why? And how should Canadians stave off the rise of populist politics that has engulfed the Western world?
I think we have very close historic ties, the UK with Canada, which are important to us. Big player in the Commonwealth. But importantly, Canada is one of the G7 countries of the world. It's a major developed economy. Right now, Canada is important because of the way that this debate around Trump's relationship with Canada is going. We've got an election in the not too distant future where that relationship with Trump is going to become central to it. And depending upon who leads the Liberals, and you and I both think that Mark Carney would be a good shot, both he and Poilievre are already out there with some pretty strong language about the need to push back. I also think Canada, whenever you look at the soft power league tables, Britain's always up there, America's always up there, but Canada's one of those countries that kind of, its alliances are pretty strong. It's got a lot of kind of raw materials. It's a big deal.
It's a very substantial, serious economy, serious part of our Five Eyes relationship, which people will remember as this intelligence network that links the UK, Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. It's also, I think, in a world in which is beginning to split apart. Countries like that, which I guess are kind of upper middle powers, are going to become more and more significant. Their money, their ability to get involved in helping crises. Canada's often really taken the lead on things like humanitarian crises around the world, I think will really matter. So we've got to keep watching that. How optimistic are you at the moment about the ability to defeat Poilievre after you've said that he's such an impressive performer?
Listen, I think it's going to be very difficult. The Labour Party here was, 20 points ahead and for quite a long time, and that sort of is what happened. That was the outcome. Now, I guess there was a possibility that the Tories could have changed the leader last minute, which is what the Liberals are doing. There is some kind of suggestion in the polling that Trump sort of arriving as this 300-pound gorilla is having a detrimental effect on the populist right, because they've always been so pro-Trump, as it were. But it's going to be a very, very, very tough fight for whoever gets there. There's a question here from Rob Steele, which allows us to talk about what I think has been a really fabulous interview on Leading this week, which we've just posted. Rob asks, we hear a lot about the role of Netanyahu and Hamas in the Palestine-Israel conflict. Can you talk about other political actors, e.g. Herzog, Israel's president, Palestine Authority, etc.? What role will they play in negotiations? What power do they have? And before you answer that, let me just say a little bit about Uzi Arad, former head of intelligence at Mossad, former foreign policy advisor to Netanyahu. When we announced that we had him on, we had lots of people saying, this is an outrage, you're giving this guy a platform on Holocaust Memorial Day and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, if ever there was emails and tweets coming in that underline this idea that you really don't want to listen to anything. Because for a start, what is wrong with speaking to Jewish Israelis who perhaps, he didn't actually talk much about the Holocaust, but maybe he might, it's quite a good thing to do around that time. But also the idea that this was some kind of Israeli government stooge. He had some very, very, very sharp criticisms of the current government, particularly Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, who he thinks is just an abomination. But also he had, I thought, some very, very thoughtful analysis, which maybe was aimed at trying to get us to think a little bit differently about the Israeli perspective as well.
I thought it was really interesting. And I thought it was interesting both in the ways that it will have provoked and angered some people, and also in the ways that it will have surprised people. And I think as we move into territory where we are interviewing people on the edge of conflict, we're going to find this more and more, aren't we? Just quickly on the question from the subscriber, let me just lay out the problem. So the problem is that, of course, Gaza was run by Hamas. It was a disputed election. back in the late 2000s. Then there was effectively a coup d'etat, and Hamas took over the territory and ran it for just under 20 years. And then, of course, after October the 7th, huge response, enormous number of people killed, and the Hamas leadership killed. So you had not just the killing of the military leadership, but also the killing of the civilian leadership, Ismail Haniyeh. So then the question is, if we think about reconstruction or trying to bring some normalcy back to Gaza, and it's a big if, who can play a role? Well, obviously, the most sensible thing has to be a Palestinian lead. Israel neither wants nor could, I think, try to run a full occupation in Gaza. They've tried it before. They tried in Lebanon, but this is going to be the most horrendous, costly experience for Israel if they tried to run a permanent occupation of Gaza. So which Palestinians, though? Well, the problem is that Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are the far right of Netanyahu's government, hate the idea of doing anything that would strengthen the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank. And they'd be very worried if the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank took over Gaza and was successful in Gaza, then you have more and more pressure for a two-state solution. In addition, of course, Hamas may well not want the Palestinian Authority coming in. I mean, they were at violent loggerheads, they fight each other, and there could well be a civil war if the Palestinian Authority tried to assert itself and Hamas resisted. Then you add to that possibly Egypt, which of course has a land border with Gaza, huge interest in what to do with the Palestinian community. Jordan, the majority of whose population were originally Palestinian refugees, maybe countries like Saudi. But all of that depends on the United States, because it was the US that was trying to bring together the deal. And Biden and Blinken had put this whole thing together with all these different moving parts. Israel, very, very reluctant to sign up, might just have got there if the US had really put the pressure on. But the only way the Palestinian Authority would sign up, the only way the Saudis would sign up, is if there was a two-state solution at the end of the line. And Netanyahu doesn't want that, Smotrich doesn't want that, Ben-Gvir doesn't want that. And now it looks very much as though Donald Trump doesn't want it either, which basically means everything I've been saying for the last minute can be ignored because Trump's destroying the whole thing.
I know President Herzog quite well because when he was leader of the Labour Party and when he was the Labour candidate in the 2015 election, I think it was, and I went out there had quite a few visits to Israel and meetings with him, and he wanted to pick my brains about this, that, and the other. And I found him very likable. I didn't think at the time he was going to win. So he goes on to become the president. I mean, his politics are way away from Netanyahu. But as president in this current situation, he is absolutely full on, essentially part of the government communications machine in a way. I suspect his basic views at the heart of his politics haven't changed. How much power the Israeli president has in this situation, I think in terms of policy, it feels to me like he is quite closely integrated, but whether that's power or just a reflection of the decisions that get taken by those who have the executive power, I don't know. And of course, the problem with the Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority, is partly its reputation down the years for corruption, for kind of gerontocracy and people just sort of staying well past their sell-by dates.
Including the leader, Abu Mazen, particularly.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So I think unless it becomes a bit clearer what the structures are going to be, who the outside players are going to be, I think, it's a great question that I don't actually have the answer. And I think that it's going to evolve as the post-war Gaza situation develops.
Well, we mentioned this in the main pod, but of course, your 300-pound gorilla, I'm afraid, again, is the fact that Trump has said that he's called the Egyptians and the Jordanians and told the Egyptians to take 1 million people from Gaza and Jordan to take 1 million, which is the whole population of Gaza, which is called ethnic cleansing. And at the same time, he's put out tweets saying he sees it's got great potential as a kind of Mar-a-Lago beach resort on the Med.
Incredible, absolutely incredible. Now, listen, I know you say that I don't criticise the Labour government enough, Rory, and you think I've pulled my punches, and maybe I do. Lynn Williams, why is a Labour government so intent on targeting and using damaging rhetoric about disabled people? Why do ministers keep conflating PIP with income support benefits. Both points are linked, really, says Len. Now, whether it's targeting, I'm not sure I do accept. Using damaging rhetoric, I do. I think there is far too much, and I understand you've talked about this a lot on the podcast, the need, if our economy is going to recover, then we are going to have to get a grip of the scale of welfare spending, and we're going to have to make some, pretty difficult choices. But the most important thing is actually, I think, to give people a positive sense of an economy that can work for them, jobs that can give them a good life, etc. I think there has been too much of this sort of, the sort of Osborne thing. The Labour aren't quite at the sort of, people peeking out through the curtains to see if the bailiffs are coming round. But it's too much for me about, they're there sponging off the state as opposed to being in genuine need, needing help. And I think you've got to do a bit of both. I think the problem is real. The government is right to take it seriously. The government is right to try to get the budgets under control. But I think using kind of language of Sun editorials is really not the way to do it.
Remind me, just back in the day when Tony Blair's government came in, how did you handle this? Because I guess this story around benefits cheats or people living off the state's been around for a long time. And
been around forever.
And there's a big chunk of the British public who want to hear politicians in their minds saying as it is and calling out people who they think are cheating on benefits. Were there moments where you did sound a little bit more Daily Mail-like?
Yes, there were, where there was a real plan and a real approach to try to deal with specific issues. So, for example, look, benefit fraud is a massive thing. The scale of benefit fraud during COVID was another example of it. And that was something that we went after pretty aggressively. And I do understand why this government feels it has to get these budgets under control. But I've just felt watching some of the recent communications, and actually we're seeing it a little bit more broadly like, for example, the planning stuff recently. Now, we know that NIMBYism is a problem. We do know that NIMBY is a problem, but we're not all NIMBYs. And I think what gets round that kind of thing is if you give people a bigger strategic argument about what you're trying to do as a country. So with planning, it's about, do we want to get building again or not? Do we want to get innovation? Do we want to get infrastructure or not? And with the benefit system, I think it's this sense of giving people a vision of what the economy looks like if we can get people back into work.
It's about saying, we're going to do something that's going to be uncomfortable for a group of people. Maybe we're going to build some housing estates which are going to affect the quality of life of people, or we're going to reduce benefits for people who are currently getting disability benefits, without necessarily saying that you're doing it because those are bad people. I mean, I felt that a little bit actually in the way that Keir Starmer communicated much better than Bridget Phillipson around the private school fees. Bridget Phillipson, when I said, look, how about kids who are going to have to leave private schools and re-enter the public sector, said, I don't care about the top 7%, I'm here for the 93%. Keir Starmer, by the time he was up against Rishi Sunak, had what I thought was the right answer, which is, of course we care about everybody, and that will be difficult. Unfortunately, we have to make difficult decisions, and this is the reason why we're doing it, and this is why it's going to make for a better education system. So I guess what you're saying, and unless I'm missing something, is that you could say, we completely understand why people find it difficult to have development. We completely understand that there are people who really need disability benefits. Unfortunately, there are tough choices to be made. And here's the big picture of growth, and this is the way that we're going to sort out the public finances. Yeah.
I think a lot of it is about tone and about communications. It's really odd the way that, we talked on the main podcast about the press in relation to Prince Harry. But the fact is that, for me, the problem with our press in its relation with politics has always been this sense that they have a power that is about setting the agenda. And I just feel at the moment, a Labour government with a big, big, big majority that can get stuff done has them in their heads too much. They're going to slag off the Labour government, whatever they do.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying you wouldn't find life better if they didn't, but they are.
Yeah. You could always imagine that Labour could have played it a different way. They could have come in just sort of pretending, in a way, I mean, I'm pretending maybe it's an unfair way of putting it, but really going hugely positive. We've won this enormous majority. We're turning the country around. We're going to be big and optimistic and cheerful. And we're not going to get too dragged down by the madness of Trump and Farage. And, they're in a very, very, if you step back and look at them objectively, Labour's in a very good position. The Conservatives are in trouble because Farage is eating their lunch. They're strong electorally, they're strong in parliament. They should be able to be kind of breezier about things, instead of which they seem a bit defensive, don't they?
There's an article we should put in the newsletter by somebody called Anna McShane. She's the director of the New Britain Project think tank. And I mean, the headline will probably alarm quite a lot of left of centre people. Starmer must learn from Trump, act fast, prioritise visible change, keep showing voters you're on their side. But if you take away that first, Starmer must learn from Trump, actually, yes, because you come in. I was talking to somebody, a kind of shadow minister the other day, and she said, well, we do still have a bit of time. And I said, you haven't got long in a parliament. This 4 years goes really, really quickly. And obviously the positions are different. Trump is a president. He can do all this executive orders. You regularly raise the issue of Gordon Brown and Bank of England independence. Yeah. Why was that such a big thing? That was the equivalent of one of Trump's big executive orders. Yeah. It said, this is going to be a government of big change. Yeah. And then we had the New Deal, then we had the minimum wage, then we had the Scottish Parliament. Now, Labour are doing lots of stuff, but act fast, prioritise visible change, and keep showing voters you're on their side. That is a communications thing. It's like, we had a question this week, which basically said, the government's done lots of things, but I can't remember many of them.
Right.
And what that means is, if you do have a press that is constant, they certainly remember winter fuel because, the press keep banging on about it. They certainly remember national insurance because it's still on the front pages months after the event, because now businesses are reacting to it. So when that is happening, you have to have a counter narrative that is even stronger. So this piece is actually quite interesting because, it's not saying, oh, let's bow down before Trump. And I don't think anybody should bow down before Trump. But it is saying he has shown way more than he did in the first term. The first days, the first weeks, the first months, they're really, really, really important about the direction you set. So there you go, Labour, act fast, prioritise visible change, keep showing voters you're on their side.
And I suppose one way of putting it is that every single time you do something, it should be easy for the voters, if someone said to them, why did they do it, for them to be able to answer the question. Doesn't matter what the answer is, could be growth. Oh yeah, they did that because their thing is growth. Right. I mean, whatever it is, right?
Here's where it gets tricky on the strategic side, because let's say they've just recently, they haven't sort of confirmed, but it's sort of in the ether that they're going to be revisiting the idea of a third runway at Heathrow. Yeah. Now, there are very, very, very strong arguments for it. There are very, very, very strong arguments against it. Both will be met. Now, if you're green growth, it's tricky. If you're growth, so we get that. We totally get that. Yeah. So that's where you have to be absolutely clear. So when I heard that, I thought, I wonder what Ed Miliband thinks of that. I can guess what Rachel Reeves might think about that, because that's growth, right? So that's where these have to be set within this bigger strategic framing.
We should talk a little bit more about that, I think, in maybe next week, because it's also an example of something that is never going to be built within the lifetime of this parliament, ever. So it may or may not be a good thing to do, but of course, it's an example, a little bit like HS2, of a very grand and doubtless unbelievably expensive project that will, knowing Britain, take 10, 15 years to come through. And by the time it's finished, the whole world of technology may well have changed and the whole thing may turn out to be completely useless.
Yeah. Now, Irene wants to know, Rory, this is my last question for today. How do we stay engaged with politics without sacrificing our mental health, given that everything feels so depressing at the moment? Irina Nagali, what advice would you give to young people like me who are passionate about making a difference but feel more disillusioned than ever by how toxic and polarised the debate has become? How do you stay hopeful and push for something better in such a divisive climate?
Okay, well, let me just try a very quick one on that. I think one of the issues is developing heroes, role models, ways of describing what good public life is like. I think our culture's become a very private and domestic. When we think about morality, when we think about being a good person, we think about how you treat your family, your friends. And we tend to imagine that when you get into the bigger scale, government, public life, they're all a bunch of shysters. And we just don't really have a good way of describing what it would mean to be a practical and effective leader, right? And that's about accepting that leaders are not saints. They have to compromise. They have to do a lot of politics. They have to do a lot of communications. they're going to do stuff you don't like, but that there still is objectively an enormous difference between Theresa May and Keir Starmer on the one side and Boris Johnson and Donald Trump on the other. And we need to get better at explaining what that difference is and kind of living it out. But also, I think, I'm now conscious when I said that to you, of course, that Theresa May and Keir Starmer may be seen by some people as being at the slightly boring end of things. What would it be to give a vision of somebody who is startling, exciting, lively, funny, but also represented good values?
Yeah. That thing about role models is very, very interesting. It's like, who do we admire? And of course, because at the moment, and listen, let's be frank, there are lots of people who admire some of the populist leaders. I think it's hard to sort of work out who the role models are. But as you were speaking, I was thinking, do you remember last week I told you in Davos that my favorite event was this Be Hope event for the Sustainable Development Goals? And the highlight for me of that entire event, there were prime ministers there were presidents, there were Bill Gates, there were all sorts of huge names there. But the highlight for me, which I've written about, and we're actually going to reprint in the New European, a poem. And it was a poem delivered by a 19-year-old Nigerian American called Salome Agbaroji, if I've got that right. And the poem was called Hope. And we'll put it in the newsletter as well, if she's happy with that. Because it was just fabulous to see a 19-year-old who wrote and read from memory quite a long poem about why she stayed hopeful. And she had this wonderful line. It was, we aren't crossing our fingers, we're crossing finish lines. In other words, hope is active. Hope isn't sort of, I am hopeful, because that is passive. Hope is saying, this is what I want to do, therefore I'm going to find out how I can do it. And it was extraordinary. I've never seen a poem get such a big ovation in my life.
It's such a great subject, isn't it? And such a great word, hope. It's such a difficult word because people can always say it's kind of over-optimistic or it's unrealistic. But in the end, it's the key to everything, even if we don't really know how to put our fingers on it.
She had this talked about how hope in the end is a hero in all of history's great battles. In the end, sort of, hope wins through. And it was, honestly, it was when you say, where do you get hope? I'm always being asked, where do I get hope? And so are you. And it is hard. I've got to be honest, my mental health's not been good in the last few weeks because of lack of sleep, because of, I woke up this morning and the first thing I did was reach for my phone. I wanted to see basically what's Trump done while I've been asleep.
Yeah.
Well, that is not good for your mental health. It really isn't. And then if you add that to the sense that you and I both picked up in Davos, that, Britain's really got to be watching itself, it's really got to be careful about where it fits in all this. And you sort of feel, well, we're meant to be political figures. We can get engaged, we can get involved, we can make change. But then some days I wake up and think, no, this is hopeless. Now, once you've got that in your mind, it's very hard to shift.
Yeah.
So actually saying to yourself, no, I don't give a shit what they say. I don't give a shit what my enemies say. Hope is about believing that it's still worth fighting for the things that you believe in.
And believing in a sense that something can happen, that things do happen, that the world does suddenly get better in a miraculous way that you couldn't anticipate, that you look around you and it seems very bleak, and then suddenly the world surprises you.
Yeah. She had this great line. I just looked it up. Hope is not the way that we cope, but the way that we conquer. Well done, Salome. I like that. So there you go, Irene and Arena. You just got to keep believing. You've got to keep fighting.
Thank you. Well, on that word of hope, bye-bye.
See you soon.